Hi there. We just got some new casting information for A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms Season 1, the second Game of Thrones prequel spin-off, that this is a friend of Duncan's from his childhood as an orphan in the slums of King's Landing. So on a wider level, this casting update gives us the bigger confirmation that the Duncan Egg TV series actually will include flashbacks as a narrative device. Flashbacks, which Game of Thrones really avoided using as a framework. Well, to start with, the news that came out, first reported by Redanian Intelligence, is that actress Khloe Leah has joined the cast, who you may remember from her recent appearance in Dune Prophecy, Season 1, as Sister Lila. And she gave a really good performance. She's a newcomer, she's young, that this really was her starring role, that her character went through the spice agony transformation too early without training, so it unlocked her genetic memory before she was ready to control it. So all of her ancestors' genetic consciousnesses are vying for control and alternately taking over her body, like being possessed. But it's based on genetic memory. So at times, her grandmother's memories and consciousness are taking over her body. At other times, her vengeful mother is. And they had very different goals and personalities, her grandmother and her mother. So she functionally plays three characters on this show. I mean, I was really impressed that she conveys that the grandmother and mother are different from her and each other, that in line delivery, in body language, subtle body language, things that a lot of thought went into just differentiating them. And I really look forward to how she's going to do that next season. This abomination, as they called it. For thousands of years, they say, do not let someone do this unless they're absolutely ready. Otherwise, it's this perverse coming back from the dead by your genetic memory seizing control. But for us here, the news came out that she was just cast as Rafe, one of Dunk's childhood friends when he was living as an orphan in Flea Bottom, the worst slum in King's Landing. And this was outright Dickensian, that he grew up half feral, homeless, and stealing to survive along with a few other children, that he has no memory of his parents, just his earliest memories fade into running around in the streets. He had no home, and like a pack of animals, he said, some of my group of kids were named Rafe, Pudding, and Ferret, and we'd run around stealing things. And I'm just putting the block quote on the screen here. I'm not going to waste time reading it off, but these were book characters. We don't know any specifics about them. He just listed them off. He didn't say what each one was like. Though you get the impression that they were all boys, these street urchin boys, but it has nothing to do with the character's role, so make one a girl, fine, it doesn't really change anything. What matters is that they're street orphans. What does surprise me, though, is her age. That Dunk left the streets when he was only 6 years old. I went back and checked. It says that he was taken as a squire by the knight Sir Arlen, and he squired for him for about 10 years, that he's 16 when the story begins. And I knew he'd have to be older in a TV show, because how many 6'7", 16-year-olds do you know? But it now appears that TV Dunk was living as this orphan street rat well into his late teens, going by Khloe Leah's age. Then he was a squire for like 10 years, because Peter Claffey, who plays Dunk, is actually 29. But okay, I understand it. For the change in format, you need to age up characters. I wouldn't expect a 16-year-old Dunk, so minus 10 years, he was probably a street urchin well into his teens. That's fine. By the way, for Khloe Leah, even though late teens in Dune, she's actually one of several Westeros show actors in that thing. It's just fun that they're like episode 3 of season 1. Mark Addy was in it as the old Harkonnen uncle, and Oscar Tully was in it briefly, Archie Barnes. Khloe Leah actually isn't even the first actor playing a character in that from specifically A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. That there's a brief minor role of a spy from the Resistance with the Atreides guy, who is going to go on to play Maekar, Egg's father. So she's actually the second one from that coming into play in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. But, it's the HBO stable of actors. It's just nice to see the crossover of, well, this is these rival feudal houses in space. So we had fun with Dune Prophecy last fall. Everyone who watches HBO shows stuck around for that, and it was surprisingly good. But when you look at her age, she looks like she's 18 or something, playing 18 or something, so fine, they had to age him up, he was a street urchin for longer. In and of itself, this isn't huge news. Rafe is a minor character. We just wondered, would he mention he was a street urchin? Would we see that? Based on the sets they were building, they built what we thought looked like an alleyway in a city, and otherwise, the entire story takes place at this tournament ground at Ashford, and like the tavern outside of it, there wouldn't be a city street, so we figured, we think they're actually going to film parts of his childhood, but this just confirms that. Really confirms that with the casting from a notable up-and-coming actor. That's good. In and of itself. And that's the end of the actual news part of this. The rest of this is just my rant about the wider implications. If you want to stick around for that. That why is this so mind-blowing to us? If you're new here, we have been debating this for the past 2 years since it was announced, before we even saw, there looks like there's a alleyway set there. How are they going to handle the narrative framing devices in this? Well, first, a specific issue with the Dunk and Egg novellas is that, unlike the main novels, they're only told from exactly one POV. Dunk, that there is only one POV narrator, Duncan the Tall. Even Egg, they don't say things from his perspective yet. Though it's not, unlike pretty much every other prequel, House of the Dragon is based on an in-universe history book, which is an outline, Fire and Blood. The Dunk and Egg novellas are the only other thing in the franchise that is fully narrativized, where it's told from a character's perspective. So it's not as bad in some ways for House of the Dragon that you go, well, obviously Rhaenyra would be a POV, Alicent would be a POV, and I actually did a video on how Condell mentioned in passing, oh yeah, off the top of my head, there's like 19 POV characters. They actually have a list of these are POVs, like down to the level of Tywin Lannister. You need to, when you're writing a small council scene, know what is Tywin thinking now to judge how you'd write the line, how would he react. But for a third-tier recurring guard character, you don't really need to do that. And they had this whole video saying how in the visual medium of television, you need to keep track of more POVs because the camera looks at more than one person compared to a book where it's... The first novel only had 8 POVs. It never really had more than 12. Even so, it's a bit limiting that it's mostly from Dunk's perspective. Well, it all is, and it's a smaller scale show. The story is not skipping around in continents. But there are points when characters will recall events to Dunk through vivid narration. Not so much in the first one, but like, in the first one, Dunk will recall when Sir Arlen dies in the first scene. He'll recall things he did with Sir Arlen that, oh, please let me into the tournament, I'm a newly knighted guy who I was a squire to Sir Arlen. No one remembers him, and then Baelor Breakspear goes, oh yeah, I remember jousting with Sir Arlen about 5 years ago. Okay, yeah, let the guy sign up for the list. I mean, who knows if he'll even do well, but no, I jousted with Sir Arlen. So you're wondering, like, would they do a brief flashback to that? Would that just be dialogue? But more so in the later novellas, like starting in the second one, how would they explain what the Blackfire Rebellion is? Would we get flashbacks to the Blackfire Rebellion? Was top of the list a major question. And the Dunk and Egg novellas are the only prequel that's ever gotten comic book adaptations, which finished because there's 3 short novellas that are already done, that you can go out and buy a combination volume of the compendium of them, that in the bound volume, which I have, of The Sworn Sword, it just switches to showing 4 or 5 panels in sepia tone of the Blackfire Rebellion and the Battle of the Red Grass Field. Please tell me in the comments if you have a copy and know what I'm talking about. Back me up here. But it actually has what in comic book terms is a flashback. That it's 4 full pages of sepia tone while someone else is narrating to Dunk, but we're hearing their words. This is what happened at the Battle of the Red Grass Field, what Bloodraven did with the archers, how Daemon Blackfire died, the hammer and the anvil, all of that. So we've been going, you really need to do that in the format of a flashback or something. Yeah, it's more of a Season 2 issue. It's not as prominent in Season 1, but increasingly as they explain things that happened. And this type of thing happens all the time, even in the main novels. I mean, how many times, think of examples of when, even though it's a Ned Stark POV chapter, he's vividly remembering events from Robert's Rebellion of, and there was that day where I came into King's Landing and saw the Targaryen children's corpses laid out, and I was angry about it. It's not a dialogue scene, like framed as dialogue. It's just him recalling it in his head. You need to translate that into a live-action format. You can't just... It's easy to have what is essentially a flashback in a novel, any novel, within text structure. That's easy. It is hard to translate that to television, and more or less my good example that springs to mind is Lord of the Rings trilogy did have some flashbacks for exposition now and then. But it's not a fantasy trope, it's just like Elrond going, I was there 3,000 years ago and Isildur would not destroy the ring, and they just show that, as opposed to him just giving his speech. By and large, this is the whole point, by and large, Game of Thrones failed to do that. To use flashbacks as a basic tool of exposition, which you need to do for a show where for a story where people in the book frequently remember things from the past, and it isn't presented in dialogue, so you can't just lift it straight from the book. Benioff and Weiss didn't use flashbacks, and we later found out they actively avoided flashbacks. It was an official rule they had. But near the end of the show, when we saw the full pitch proposal they originally gave HBO to sell the show to them and get a pilot filmed, they had this whole section saying why they wanted to take out as many fantasy elements as possible in order to market the show to a more mainstream audience of football players and soccer moms. But within that same paragraph, they actually specified, so we won't include fantasy tropes like prophecies and flashbacks. Well, first of all, that explains why they only ever half-heartedly put in the stuff about the prince that was promised prophecy and wouldn't have Daenerys having visions in the House of the Undying of Rhaegar and the prophecy and things. Kind of forgot about it altogether. Well, they didn't forget, they chose not to. But second, I can see all prophecies are a fantasy thing. How the heck are flashbacks a trope specifically associated with the fantasy genre? That's nonsense. I mean, like Breaking Bad had flashbacks in it now and again. And remember, at the start of Season 5, they had one straight-up flashback. And had they never used flashbacks, it wouldn't have been as noticeable. The fact that this was the first and really only time they did that highlighted how unusual it was that they chose not to. Later on, they'd use the excuse that Bran having visions isn't the same thing as his straight-up flashback, so they can use Bran as the eyes of the audience. But other than that, that's not really, as they said, that isn't really a flashback, in terms of just flashbacks by any old character, that only Bran could have flashbacks, because he's magic. You can't just have Ned Stark vividly remembering something. Well, it was one straight-up flashback, the cold open to Season 5 with young Cersei, and took out that kind of forgot that there's a prophecy the younger brother will kill her and all this other junk because they don't want it. That was the last moment where they were kind of paying lip service to doing that stuff in the book, but we realized later they were dragging their feet. They didn't want to do that, and later just dropped it altogether, bare minimum. But I remember is in the inside the episode to the Season 5 premiere, Benioff flippantly remarks, "Oh yeah, we consider flashbacks a cheap trick, so we don't do them." And this is a novelist who has not worked in television before this project, now talking like an expert on the entire narrative device of flashbacks are just a cheap trick. As if he's an expert. It's weird how the media didn't report on how increasingly bizarre the inside the episodes with them were from season 5 onward. That if you thought they sounded insane in the season 8 ones, they were saying that shit for years. Since at least season 5, it got notably weird, and the news just didn't cover it. But anyway, just how they were marketing, I don't like flashbacks because they're a cheap trick. Benioff later admitted, he admitted at another point, I avoid flashbacks because I'm bad at them. That it reminds me of that whole thing of in drawing, hands are difficult to draw, officially. It's considered a thing that hands are hard to draw. So it's sort of a thing with art teachers that when they see a student going, there's a whole joke of the student who goes, I have everyone have hands in their pockets or off screen, and the teacher goes, you're avoiding drawing hands because it's difficult. I can tell. Because you're bad at it. And instead of going, well, we don't really need to show the hands that much, do we? Arguing against, because it's hard. Not because it's lazy, because it's a cheap trick, it's you're bad at it. Where did he say this? When I started my channel, I was researching just what the heck was Benioff's career like, that he really was not trained at all. He has no formal screenwriting training. That I watched the first recording he ever made, in terms of an interview, was back in 2002, the DVD commentary he made for his film 25th Hour. And there's just all sorts of things he admits in that. If you have your own YouTube channel, if you want to dig into this, watch that DVD commentary. It is weird, the things he admits to, and that no one picked up on, that we were just presented with by, the trade magazines going, he's such a genius in 2011, and if you followed his career, he really wasn't. And things he openly says, I have no formal writing training, I have no experience working with the logistics of organizing a TV production. So season 8 should not have been a surprise to you. Season 5 shouldn't have been a surprise to us had we not been lied to. But in this DVD commentary, he says one of the many things he admits is, I wrote this book as Oscar bait. That when people go, oh no, he was a famous award-winning novelist, the way he got 25th Hour published, and he admits this, is telling the publisher, we will use this as the basis for an Oscar bait movie. That there's a whole cottage industry of writing books that you can then turn it, because it sounds more prestigious for an awards bait movie to say, oh no, this isn't an awards bait movie tailored to a specific actor, it's based on a book. Which if you check the timeline, they had commissioned the movie before the book actually hit store shelves. So it's just a lie, that the whole thing was that sunk cost fallacy of, like he made the failed pilot, therefore we have to order the actual show. Well, I already sold the book rights for an adaptation, therefore you have to make my movie. The whole thing, his entire career, was just riding the coattails and showing off the famous actors, showing off the faces. It's a consistent pattern. Okay, but getting to the point, one of the things that really struck me in that, there's a specific point where the main character, who's played by Edward Norton, who's out on bail, and the whole thing, he's been convicted of drug possession because he did, and he has to go to jail voluntarily in 24 hours, or otherwise they'll, increase your sentence and grab you by force. So he's out waiting for going into prison for the last day of his free life for 10 years. And there's a scene where he's having a flashback to when he was arrested the first time, when they found the drugs in his apartment. And so there's this big flashback scene, and on the commentary, and it's not even so much what he says, which is stupid, but I can't express to you more the way he says it, that just how befuddled Benioff seems. That he's rambling about how much he had to struggle with, how do I differentiate that this is a flashback set in the past? As if this is this mind-blowing, complex idea like putting a man on the moon, and not something movies and TV do all the time. And ultimately, the actual director, he was just, they had screenwriting on him, but they even said, I wrote the book and I wrote a screenplay, but we sold it to director Spike Lee, and Spike Lee had to rewrite the script for me. That he contributed very little to that movie in terms of, it's all the actors and the actual directors. Again, no surprise, that's what Game of Thrones was, but that Spike Lee had to explain to him, no, I'll do a flashback, I'll just give him a goatee in the flashback, a beard that he doesn't have in the present day because he shaved. That this was mind-blowing to Benioff of how do you differentiate that something is a flashback? Which shouldn't be too much of a surprise because this is a first-time novelist with zero experience working in the visual medium of cinema. Of course, he's utterly mystified by these basic tasks at page-to-screen adaptation on his own book. Because flashbacks in a prose novel are easy. You just have a character for even a full page recalling things and their inner thoughts through vivid narration. Translating that to screen with dialogue and making clear this is in the past it requires thought. And herein is my point. In the comment section, please, I make these because I want to see what you guys say. Please, in the comments, share how other major TV or film projects you've seen did transitions between the present and flashbacks in order to clarify. How did they clarify that something was happening in the past? Maybe through voiceover, someone was recalling, oh, this is what happened in the past. Maybe the camera zoomed in on the character's face and then they were wearing different clothes and looked younger. Something. But it isn't really that hard. Shows do it all the time. That the contrast between how Benioff scoffed that flashbacks are cheap, but then admitted in his own DVD commentary years before, I actually struggle with flashbacks because they're hard to do and I have no formal screenwriting training. Like Lost, for example, did flashbacks a lot. I mean, that was easy to differentiate because they're not on a tropical island, but other things, I remember Breaking Bad having flashbacks, other shows that presumably be easy to deal with a flashback to Child Dunk or Child Ned Stark without a narration or without, Bran seeing it. If there's a kid and they're calling him Ned, you can tell who that is because they're played by a different actor. So he's just this inexperienced novelist who never worked in live action before, but the media hype machine built them up into, by 2011, these are these savant geniuses who are masterminds at every aspect of filmmaking, from cinematography to logistics. This is the lie we were all sold. And the one they still try to peddle with their deal over at Netflix, that, well, he's, this creative genius, he's a TV showrunner genius. Meaning what specifically in terms of the technical checklist of required skills for filmmaking? So the point of my whole channel, my whole argument is, they were figureheads from day one. Even in the relatively good first 4 seasons, they were figureheads because every mistake on the pilot they repeated later. And it just seems that eventually the guardrails came off, that there were guardrails HBO put in place to babysit them through seasons 1 and 4, and okay, they're a figurehead. At least under the banner of a figurehead, you can put out a good show so long as everyone else is allowed to do their job. But as they got increasingly egocentric and, monopolizing things, they'd order their directors to do stupid things like, no, it needs to be nothing but tight close-ups, or film in the dark, or ridiculous logistic demands. There came a point where they stopped listening to their own babysitters. But this was always there, and you need to only look at the unfilmed pilot to know that was a problem. I mean, to quote their own repeated boast, they boasted this more than once. It was the world's most expensive film school. First-time film students were in charge of the American Tolkien's literary classic, who didn't even know how to handle the relatively common narrative device of flashbacks. Now, I want you to think about this. When people praised that Benioff and Weiss were responsible for quote-unquote making Game of Thrones, what specifically were they responsible for? Were they responsible for the music? No, other than they actually are. Brian Cogman actually went, you can't differentiate that. There's this whole Twitter rant he did where you can't say you like the music and you like the acting, but you hate the writers because I hired them. He really said that. I have a video on that, but no, they did not personally make the music. They're not personally responsible for the acting. More specifically, did they come up with the core story? The idea that there's Westeros, it has 7 kingdoms, there's the Iron Throne, there's the White Walkers. They didn't make the Storyverse. So how much of this was just people reacting to the watered-down but still pretty cool idea of Westeros and White Walkers and everything and Daenerys? You didn't originate the story idea. You're adapting it. On my channel, I've tried to go down this as a checklist. I've been reporting on the prequels for 2 years now, so eventually I will do this better than the slapdash job I did at the beginning. But the thing I'm trying to do is present this as a objective checklist of learned skills, technical skills that they were objectively bad at. I mean, for something like painting, a child would say, oh, I like this painting, it's good, like the Mona Lisa. And you go, well, why is it good? That there is a science to this of principles of color theory or principles of perspective lines. There's math involved of what makes this good or not. And what I've tried to do a little, and I will talk about more in the future, is cinematography principles. There is a science to cinematography, and they would break rules of it. And people go, oh, this is such great cinematography, meaning what? You're just describing how that they put a lot of expensive stuff on screen at a big scale. They built a whole castle. They got 100 extras fully armored. But the actual camera work isn't very good. You just don't know what you're talking about. Like, if you, I used painting it as an example. Someone goes, I like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. What did you like about it? How it's playing with structure, how it's repeating things. No, they don't know how to assess this as a professional critic. That sometimes there was good camera work in Game of Thrones because HBO assigned their best A-list directors to it, some of them Sopranos veterans. Because of the sunk cost fallacy that Benioff said, you'd better churn out a TV show to make your money back on the pilot you bought. And it worked too well that they had really good babysitters who managed to turn it into a good show in spite of them. And like I said, the problem is they just stopped listening to their handlers. Eventually they stopped listening to their handlers by season 5 because they wanted out. So even as late as season 6 or even season 8, there's 1 or 2 points where there's what I would call good cinematography. But as I've said before, that's because this is a one-time the cinematographer managed to win an argument. Or because the director slipped it in without their knowledge. Because if you follow their actual statements on what they wanted to do, what they were ordering directors to do, increasingly micromanaging them, their sole concept of visuals was vanity shots of lead actor faces. Tight close-ups without any motion in order to pander them for awards. And that's just cinematography. I mean, I'm going through because there's a basic list of this isn't a wide shot, that they built the staircase to nowhere, that there was a staircase. They even remarked on the commentary, oh yeah, we built a $10,000 staircase, then never put the camera on it, or because it was too dark, or they'd build a bakery that they never pointed the camera at, or there really are 300 extras in a scene, but there's nothing but close-ups on Sansa. And this was a problem going back to the pilot, that if you follow the comments on it, that just the stray remark, it could have been filmed in a parking lot. There weren't any wide shots in it. That to show, no, we actually did location filming. We actually built expensive sets because they're so obsessed with the faces that not from an artistic point, but from a money standpoint, HBO is yelling at them, you are wasting money building sets you don't film with all these tight close-ups. So, which leads into the next skill set that overlaps with that to a degree, filming logistics and organization. This is a massive logistical planning effort. And like cinematography, there are a parade of examples, each worse than the last, of basic logistic planning failures Benioff and Weiss made. And that's not even getting into things like the stunt safety things they insisted on, the stunt safety problems where, no, just film that with horses, or you can film that next to a cliff, or actually the worst example was the season 7 Ironborn ship fight, that there was just people catching on fire, people falling through wooden floors, and just, we don't care, that they didn't think about that it isn't safe to do that. But even ignoring that, just from a logistical standpoint, they were wasting money and throwing it at things. And it's the biggest show in the world. Like, profit margins are a thing, and by the time they were done, Warner was heavily indebted. That was more of an example of a trend, but it didn't help. Basic things like time management, like they honestly thought they could film Battle of the Bastards in 2 weeks, when the director said it would take at least 6. So, what I'm saying is, by process of elimination, like an art teacher, or a cinematography teacher, or a construction work planner, like someone planning construction of a building, there is a timetable and a budget. By process of elimination, what skills do they have at... They're these master showrunners. That they didn't make up the story, or the music, or special effects, or the VFX team. They aren't the actors. The story is Martin's. Logistically, they were failures at organizing this. And again, the world's most expensive film school saying, we didn't even know that a costume department needs more than one person in it, is an actual quote. The actual costume department has over 100 people in it, and that they didn't even know how to send memos coordinating between the departments. They explain all this openly. By process of elimination, what are you saying they were actually good at? That they were good at screenwriting, and the phrase is that you're saying that they were good at adapting page to screen? That even if you take as a given, okay, logistics are the director's thing, even though it was increasingly their fault because they overruled the directors, bare minimum, their defenders can say, oh, well, they were the ones adapting page to screen. Even that fails if you go down a specific checklist of things like in a screenwriting workshop that you go over, these are things you need to worry about when you're adapting page to screen. As you would describe it from a specific technical standpoint in a career screenwriter workshop of some kind at a university with a team of other professional screenwriters. I've made whole other videos on this, that their scripts look like novels. Unusual, paragraph-long directions of, this is what your character is thinking now, which just jump out at you as this is unusual, that this is a level of detail that cannot be conveyed through the actor's facial expressions. Not to the level of conveying exposition, which they honestly thought they could do or assumed they could do. That infamously, and I talk about this in the video on the pilot, check my channel, in the failed pilot, and they've joked about this, oh yeah, we forgot to mention in dialogue that Jaime and Cersei are brother and sister. And when we later got copies of the script years later, it's because it only mentions Jaime and Cersei are brother and sister in the script notes, not the actual dialogue parts. This is a basic, childish mistake. And on top of that, they'd have like those weird paragraph-long things of, like when you see the brief video clips we have of a table read of Brian Cogman reading it off as if he's doing a radio show, and it's, no, scripts don't look like this. Professional scripts do not do that. They're describing so much of a character's mental state from the examples we have of scripts we later got. Or what's that line of Her Satanic Majesty's request, and like making these weird jokes to the, I think they were aimed at the cast members, I don't know, but no one is going to see things in the script notes. This is written like a book, which shouldn't be surprising because, again, they're mediocre novelists who never worked a day of their lives in cinema before. So if you're talking about page to screen adaptation, the whole idea of how do we get exposition from non-dialogue paragraphs in a book into it has to be conveyed in dialogue from characters, they were bad at that, objectively. How did this happen? And did they suddenly forget? Because this happened in the pilot. Are you actually claiming, let's stop and talk about, fixate on this for 40 minutes instead of glossing over it. Are you actually claiming that they didn't know that in the pilot, but then learned that principle during seasons 1 and 4 of, oh no, you're not supposed to put exposition in script notes, only to, they miraculously managed to learn that in a single year by season 1, because season 1 itself was good? Are you claiming they miraculously, with no training or experience, learned these writing principles, and then by season 5, suddenly forgot them again, even more miraculously? Simplest answer being most probable, because you don't just suddenly learn a skill, then even weirder, suddenly forget it. It looks like they were figureheads that HBO propped up in the early seasons. That, because you have writing aids. I don't think they were shadow writers as such. I just think they'd hand them back with corrections, pointing out, hey, David, this script never actually mentions something like Jaime and Cersei, your brother and sister. You left it in the script notes through season 1 through season 2 that you need to convey this part in dialogue here. They handed it back corrected, basically. That they had babysitters. And even on the logistical level, there were problems in the first 4 seasons, but they were not as big as the later ones when they went drastically wasting money and throwing it around. I think it's just after they were megastars, after the Red Wedding, after winning Emmys, because the Emmys gutted their voting rules, season 5 onward, the guardrails were off, and they weren't listening to their own handlers. That's why the scripts in season 5 look a lot like the pilot again. But what's darkly amusing to me are the handful of hype media types who still make excuses for Benioff and Weiss even today, and I've seen them this year, claiming, well, they're better at adapting material than they are at actually creating original content. What other content? They made exactly one major project, one adaptation, before they willfully abandoned the remaining source material from the 4th and 5th books long before they ran out of source material. What I'm circling around is they managed to get that big new contract with Netflix, which they got put in charge of that adaptation of the sci-fi novel series Three Body Problem. And it's a hard sci-fi story. I don't know how you can make that into a hit, but admittedly it was presentable. Probably because they assigned a third showrunner to it who was more experienced than they were. And again, I think they're figureheads. But regardless, and I said this in videos, even if this show is a hit, they signed one of those mega contracts on the level of something Ryan Murphy gets, that you pay them $200 million. It's for more than one show. And they didn't suggest any new ideas. When have they had an original idea? Remember when they signed that contract in 2020? And we were laughing. We all had a good laugh at the actual press release saying, well, they're creative geniuses. But now they're backtracking going, wait, no, well, they're not creative geniuses as in creative, originating. I mean, they're genius adapters. You see the retrenching there. Remember when 2017, when they tried to pitch that Confederate show? Like, what other original ideas that they can't really claim that it's embarrassing that the amount of money Netflix paid them and they made one project, even if it's good. It isn't the next Game of Thrones, which is what they paid for. It isn't like something on the scale of Amazon's Fallout or something, that this didn't really capture the public eye. I mean, it broke even. And people honestly thought that they were going to pitch original ideas. These guys who didn't even write that many books before and who had never adapted, they made one adaptation of one project. What even makes you think they could handle things from other genres? What was weird after 4 years of nothing from them, that only to have this presentable sci-fi novel adaptation, which logistics I think were handled by other people, there are still hype media reporters like James Hibbard and people like him, claiming that they're putting the spin on it. Well, they haven't had original ideas in 5 years, but they're really good at adapting page to screen. Screenwriting, specifically page-to-screen adaptation, is a learned skill. It is a technical skill. I use the examples of painting or Beethoven. Even like every idiot thinks I can be my own garage band that'll hit it big, or I'll be a rapper just because I have a microphone. The good musicians, the good rappers, you see them in the recording studio, that there is a science to screenwriting, to rhyming schemes with rapping, that there is, with the notes, with the lyrical structure, there is a technical skill to this. You're just some child playing around with a microphone thinking you're good at it? That there is a checklist of skills, one of which is, do not put paragraph-long descriptions of characters' inner mental states into exposition in the script, because the audience can't see that. Related to that the whole screw up with the script note exposition, Another pretty big, specific narrative technique, technical skills, narrative technique, which is if you were going to go down, what are the major structural differences between text-based novels and the visual format of cinema? It's a lot easier for a text-based novel to include flashbacks or exposition through vivid memories. The difficult task is translating this into a live-action TV film project, which usually means either shifting it into a dialogue scene or straight up showing it in flashback scenes, and then being able to differentiate, well, this is a flashback because that guy has a beard before, he looks younger, is wearing different clothes. That is easily among the top 3 things that if you were to make a list of what are the skills associated with adapting page to screen, is how to handle exposition through dialogue or flashback. So just by elimination, what part were they good at? What part were they good at, are you claiming? So, just thinking of that, I mean, like Lord of the Rings, I remember there's this really exposition-heavy scene with Gandalf and Saruman in the first movie, when he goes to Isengard. They filmed like 40 hours of footage for that. It's not just because Jackson records a lot of takes, that I remember them explaining, Christopher Lee, Ian McKellen would explain, this is such a crucial exposition-heavy scene that you have to get the balance just right of enough exposition that the audience will understand the story without it sounding like they're just reading off a book for 20 minutes straight. That you can't do that, it has to work in the visual medium. So they kept refining it. And that is my example of page-to-screen adaptation, specifically the Gandalf-Saruman Isengard scene of how much or how little exposition do we have that they had to shift it into dialogue, because the Council of Elrond is where a lot of that comes up, and it's really the longest chapter in the entire trilogy, but things like that, or other points where they will flash back to, okay, this is when Faramir was looking for Boromir, but it wasn't like a fantasy trope, it just felt like a movie in general. In contrast, this is the opposite of, well, they're good at page-to-screen. Can you cite an example of when they condensed book exposition into dialogue or flashback? Usually they just chopped stuff out or kind of forgot. So that's the thing I need to keep bringing up, that one day I hope to yell about it. Real convention panels I've been to convention panels in the audience where there's like half a dozen screenwriters talking about the art of adaptation at Comic-Cons and local cons. And then we have these guys going, oh yeah, we're just bad at it, but we're famous anyway. Of course, all this came to bite them in the ass at the Austin Film Festival in late 2019, when they were used to boasting about how unskilled they were to a general audience at Comic-Con who didn't know what they were talking about, that they were in such a bubble that they would boast to an audience of mostly professional screenwriters that, oh yeah, this is the world's most expensive film school. I don't know how to handle page-to-screen adaptation in dialogue or by using flashbacks. And just the spell was broken and people actually started yelling at them. So the point is, for this new show, that was a big question going into Game of Thrones before Season 1 aired. Will there be flashbacks? I mean, real flashbacks of dialogue between Rhaegar and Lyanna was a major question back before Season 1. Not that they cameo in a Bran vision at one point, but real appearances by them, or will we see more of them in the House of the Undying visions? As a literary technique, if you look at the cinematography, the logistics, the storytelling actual parts, not just, oh, they made up a funny dialogue scene now and then between Robert and Cersei or something, that, oh, this is nice. It's structurally you didn't make good use of flashbacks, that you weren't good at conveying things through dialogue. So we were wondering, is there going to be a point where Dunk is talking to Egg about, oh, I grew up half feral in King's Landing, there are these 3 other kids I was with, it was Dickensian, and one of them was Rafe, and we did this, or are we actually going to see that in a flashback scene? They're going to show it in a flashback scene. And the bigger implication is for Season 2, are they just going to have Dunk talking to a maester for 20 minutes about, this is what the Blackfire Rebellion was like? Because that's a thing that ultimately happened in Game of Thrones. We never saw Robert's Rebellion. People just described it. Will they handle the Battle of the Red Grass Field as Game of Thrones handled the Battle of the Trident, where it's talked about but not really shown, or will we get flashbacks to that? And I don't think they'll tell the entire story because, I want them to show bits of it with guys wearing helmets so they can recast them in later shows. That 5-10 years from now, I do want a Blackfire Rebellion show, like 5-year show that goes from the conquest of Dorne, multi-generational, through the reign of Aegon IV, culminating in the war between his sons in the final season. That's my personal wish list for how to handle the Blackfire Rebellion in full, because it was a full war. It wasn't just the final battle. But, different actors wearing helmets so they can be recast in a later project. For all of, as much as we saw the original war against Sauron in The Lord of the Rings, there's brief flashbacks so you can tell it's Arendelle and Gil-galad, but bits of it, the important part, just skip to the final confrontation where Sauron loses the ring. I'm hoping, it appears that we will probably be getting a flashback showing the death of Daemon Blackfire at the Battle of Red Grass Field. Maybe not the whole thing, maybe not the whole war, but this opens that up, as so much of the second novella is flashbacks to this is the plague that happened off-screen between novellas. This is what the Blackfire Rebellion was. A lot of it is that's the first time they really explain what the Blackfire Rebellion was. So if you take out showing these things on screen, and we wonder, well, technically the plague isn't a flashback. If they could have put it in like the first 3 episodes of season 2 and just show it chronologically, Blackfire Rebellion is flat out a flashback. How do you present that material? That Ira Parker actually knows we need to use flashbacks. I don't really blame House of the Dragon for not using flashbacks because due to its structure, that it is a flashback. All of season 1 was, what if we just show the flashbacks in chronological order? Would be less confusing. Imagine if they did that. Started with Viserys' death, then every other episode was a flashback with these 2 parallel storylines of how Alicent and Rhaenyra turned on each other.